Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at fuel metabolism in vertebrates, but not just the basics. We're going beyond single cells here.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at how entire organs, right, collaborate to make sure the organism as a whole is functioning properly.
So it's more than just like one cell kind of doing its own thing, right?
Exactly. It's a really dynamic process, really. Each of these organs has their own, metabolic preferences.
Oh, okay. So are you saying like organs are picky eaters or something?
You could say that, yeah. For example, the brain, that's our most, high-maintenance energy hog, reliant almost entirely on glucose.
Interesting. So what happens when we haven't eaten in a while and our glucose levels drop? Does the brain just stop working?
Well, not exactly. Thankfully, the body has some pretty impressive backup systems in place. During fasting, like you're describing, the liver steps up to the plate and starts producing ketone bodies.
Ketone bodies.
Yeah, it's sort of like a metabolic reserve fuel that the brain can use when glucose is scarce.
So the liver's like a metabolic multitasker, huh?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's not just the liver. Muscle, heart, adipose tissue, all these organs play their own unique roles in this sort of intricate energy balancing act.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how all of this kind of works together. But who's the director of this whole operation? It seems so complex.
Well, that's where hormones come in. Think of them as the conductors of this metabolic orchestra. They send signals to different organs to adjust their activities based on the body's needs and what fuel is available.
So how do these hormonal conductors know, when to cue the different sections of the orchestra?
Well, there are three major players we need to talk about: insulin, glucagon, and epinephrine.
All right, let's start with insulin. What does it do?
Think of insulin as the body's head chef after a big meal. When blood glucose levels rise, usually after we eat, the pancreas releases insulin. It acts as a signal telling cells throughout the body to take up glucose from the blood and use it for energy or store it for later.
So insulin's like the key that unlocks the door for glucose to enter our cells.
That's a great analogy. And it also promotes the storage of excess glucose as glycogen, primarily in the liver and muscles.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about glucagon?
Well, glucagon comes into play when blood glucose levels start to drop, which usually happens between meals or during fasting. It's like the pantry manager making sure there's always fuel available, even when we haven't eaten recently.
So is it like the opposite of insulin then?
Exactly. It signals the liver to break down that stored glycogen and release glucose back into the bloodstream. It also promotes gluconeogenesis.
Gluconeogenesis.
That's the process of actually making new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, like amino acids.
So the liver can make its own glucose, like it has its own glucose factory.
Yeah, you got it. And that's really important, especially when we're not constantly eating, to keep those blood glucose levels nice and stable.
Wow. All right, now what about epinephrine? That's the fight or flight hormone, right?
Yeah, that's the one. Epinephrine kicks in during times of stress or intense physical activity. It triggers a really quick mobilization of energy stores to give us that boost we need to face a challenge.
So it's like the emergency energy button.
Pretty much. It stimulates the breakdown of glycogen in both the liver and muscles for a quick burst of glucose. It increases heart rate and blood flow to get that glucose and oxygen where they need to go. And it promotes lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat in adipose tissue.
Wow, that is quite a response. So to recap, insulin, glucagon, and epinephrine are all working together to keep our blood sugar levels balanced, even when we're eating, fasting, or facing a challenge.
Exactly. They're constantly monitoring and adjusting to keep everything in check.
Okay, but I'm wondering how all of this actually works at the cellular level. How do our cells know what to do with the glucose once it gets inside?
That's a great question. And to really understand that, we need to zoom in and take a look at something called hormonal regulation of fuel metabolism. It all starts with these hormones binding to specific receptors on the surface of cells.
Okay, so they're not just floating around randomly. They have specific targets.
Exactly. And when a hormone binds to its receptor, it's like flipping a switch. It initiates a cascade of signaling events inside the cell.
So it's like a chain reaction, starting with the hormone binding to the receptor and then triggering all these other things inside the cell.
That's a great way to think about it. And these signals ultimately lead to changes in the activity of enzymes.
Enzymes, right? Those are like the worker bees of metabolism.
You got it. They're responsible for all sorts of tasks, like breaking down nutrients, building new molecules, and keeping the cell's metabolic engine running.
Okay, so the hormones send the signals and the enzymes do the work.
Exactly. Let's use insulin as an example. When it binds to its receptor on the cell surface, it activates a pathway called the PI3-HACT pathway.
PI3-CAST-ACT pathway.
Yeah. Think of it as a central command center for the cell, regulating lots of processes like glucose uptake, glycogen synthesis, and protein synthesis.
Wow, that one pathway does all of that.
It's a busy pathway, that's for sure. One of the key things it does is promote the movement of glucose transporters to the cell membrane.
Glucose transporters?
Yeah, these are proteins, specifically GLUT4, that act like doorways for glucose to enter the cell.
So when insulin activates this pathway, it's essentially telling the cell to open more doorways for glucose to come in.
Exactly. That increased glucose uptake is crucial for keeping those blood sugar levels in check and providing the cells with energy.
I'm starting to see how it all works together, but what about glucagon? How does it signal cells to release glucose?
Well, glucagon works a little differently. It binds to its own specific receptor on the cell surface, which triggers a cascade of events that ultimately increase the levels of a molecule called cyclic AMP, or CAN-AMP for short.
CAN-AMP, what's that?
Think of it like an intracellular messenger molecule carrying the glucagon signal to other parts of the cell.
Oh, so it's like a game of telephone, with CAN-AMP passing the message along.
That's a fun way to think about it. One of the main targets for CAN-AMP is an enzyme called protein kinase A, or PKA.
Okay, so we have CAMP activating PKA. Then what?
Well, PKA then activates another enzyme called glycogen phosphorylase. And this enzyme is the one responsible for breaking down glycogen into glucose.
Ah, so that's how glucagon leads to the release of glucose from the cell.
You got it. And that's how the liver can quickly replenish those blood glucose levels when they start to dip.
This is making a lot more sense now. What about epinephrine? How does it trigger that rapid energy mobilization?
Epinephrine binds to a family of receptors called adrenergic receptors. There are a few different types, but the one we're most interested in here is the beta-adrenergic receptor.
The beta-adrenergic receptor.
Yep, it's found on a lot of different cell types, including liver cells, muscle cells, and fat cells. And when epinephrine binds to it, it triggers a signaling pathway that's similar to glucagon, involving CAMP and PKA.
So both glucagon and epinephrine can trigger glycogen breakdown, but through slightly different pathways.
Precisely. And in fat cells, epinephrine binding to that beta-adrenergic receptor activates an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase.
What does hormone-sensitive lipase do?
It's the enzyme that breaks down stored triglycerides into fatty acids.
So epinephrine tells the liver and muscles to release glucose and tells the fat cells to release fatty acids all at the same time.
Exactly. It's a really coordinated response to make sure there's enough energy available to handle pretty much anything.
This is all so incredibly intricate. Mm-hmm. It really is amazing how these cells can respond to all these different hormones and adjust their activities. Mm-hmm. But what happens when things go wrong? What are the consequences of these pathways getting disrupted?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely be diving into more in our next segment.
Sounds good. Can't wait to hear more about that.
But for now, let's take a step back and just appreciate how amazing it is that these systems work so seamlessly most of the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really shows the power of evolution and the complexity of living organisms.
Yeah, for sure. It's a real testament to that.
Okay, so we've been talking about how these pathways work at the cellular level.
Yeah.
But how does it all come together for the whole organism? How are all of these metabolic pathways coordinated?
That's a perfect transition. Let's shift our focus now and look at things from a whole body perspective.
Okay, sounds good.
We've seen how individual cells can regulate their energy balance. But now let's see how different organs communicate and cooperate to maintain energy homeostasis for the entire organism.
Because it's not just about one cell doing its own thing, right? It's about organs working together like a team.
Exactly. And that coordination is crucial to make sure all the different tissues and organs have access to the fuel they need precisely when they need it.
So where do we start?
Well, let's talk about some of the key organs involved. We've already touched on the liver's role in regulating glucose, but what about muscle tissue?
Okay, yeah. Muscle's a big energy user, right? Mm-hmm. Especially during exercise.
Exactly. Skeletal muscle is a major consumer of glucose, especially during physical activity. You could think of it like the body's engine.
Right. And I know how much energy exercise takes, for sure. But how does muscle tissue coordinate with other organs to meet those energy demands?
Well, During exercise, muscle cells can actually take up glucose from the bloodstream directly without even needing insulin.
Really? How does that work?
Exercise triggers the movement of those GLUT4 transporters we were talking about earlier to the cell membrane, even if there's no insulin around.
Oh, interesting. So exercise is like its own signal telling the muscle cells to open up those glucose doorways.
That's exactly it. And this is actually one of the reasons why exercise is so beneficial for people with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes.
Oh, I see. It's like creating a bypass for glucose to get into the cells.
Exactly. And in addition to using glucose, muscle cells can also use fatty acids for energy, especially during longer bouts of exercise.
So it's like switching fuel sources when the primary one starts running low.
That's a great analogy. And the switch to using fatty acids helps conserve that precious glucose for the brain.
Smart. So the body prioritizes where the fuel goes depending on the activity.
Exactly. That's part of the coordination we're talking about.
Okay, what happens in muscle tissue when we're not exercising?
Well, when we're at rest, muscle actually helps store glucose as glycogen.
Oh, right. I forgot that muscles can store glycogen too, not just the liver.
That's right. Muscles actually store a significant amount of glycogen.
So it's like each muscle has its own little fuel reserve.
You could say that. And this glycogen storage is stimulated by insulin, like we talked about earlier.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Or now, what about adipose tissue? I know it mainly stores fat, but does it play a role in regulating energy too?
Absolutely. Adipose tissue is much more than just a passive fat storage site. It's actually an active endocrine organ.
Wow, I never thought of fat as an endocrine organ.
It produces a number of different hormones and signaling molecules that have an impact on metabolism throughout the body.
Like what?
Well, one of the most important ones is leptin.
Leptin.
Yeah, leptin acts like a satiety signal, letting the brain know that we have enough energy stored and don't need to eat more.
So it's like the I'm full signal.
That's a great way to put it. When leptin levels are high, it tells the brain to decrease appetite and increase energy expenditure.
Makes sense. What happens if that system goes wrong?
Sometimes people can develop leptin resistance, meaning their brains don't respond to leptin signals as well anymore.
So even though they have plenty of energy stored as fat, their brain doesn't get the I'm full message.
Exactly. And that's often associated with obesity.
Oh, wow. So it's like a vicious cycle.
Oh, got it.
So adipose tissue is actually pretty important for regulating energy balance, not just storing fat.
It is. And it also produces other signaling molecules, like adiponectin.
Adiponectin.
It has anti-inflammatory and insulin-sensitizing effects.
Wow. So it seems like all these different organs are talking to each other all the time to keep things balanced.
They are. It's a really amazing system of checks and balances that make sure we have the energy we need to function.
It really is incredible. But how does the brain fit into all of this? We know it's the control center of the body, but does it play a role in regulating energy balance too?
Absolutely. The brain is essentially the master conductor of this whole metabolic orchestra.
Okay.
It receives signals from all these different organs and then integrates all that information to make decisions about energy intake, storage, and use.
So it's like the brain is the CEO making the executive decisions.
I like that analogy. And one of the key areas in the brain that's involved in all of this is the hypothalamus.
The hypothalamus.
Yes. It receives signals from hormones like leptin, insulin, and ghrelin.
Ghrelin, that's the one that makes us feel hungry.
Exactly. So the hypothalamus is constantly monitoring the body's energy status, getting updates from all these different sources.
And then what?
Based on the information it's getting, the hypothalamus can send out signals to adjust things like food intake, energy expenditure, even body temperature.
Wow, it really does a lot.
It does. It's a really crucial part of keeping everything in balance.
Okay, so we've gone from the cellular level all the way up to the brain. This is incredibly complex.
It is. And it just shows how amazing our bodies are.
Absolutely. And it really underscores how important it is to take care of our metabolic health.
That's a great point. All these systems work really hard to maintain balance, but they can only handle so much.
So what can we do to support these systems? I know our listeners are probably wondering about that now.
Well, the good news is that lifestyle choices like diet and exercise have a huge impact.
Okay, let's break that down. What kind of dietary advice would you give to our listeners?
The most important thing is to focus on whole, unprocessed foods. Things like fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, and healthy fats.
Okay, so real food, basically.
That's a good way to put it. Those foods provide the nutrients our bodies need without overloading our systems.
So we're giving our bodies the right kind of fuel, not just any fuel.
Exactly. It's also really important to pay attention to portion sizes and not overeat.
Because that can throw things off balance, right?
It can. Our cells can only handle so much, and if we're constantly giving them too much energy, it can lead to problems.
Okay, what about exercise?
Regular exercise is absolutely crucial.
I know. We hear that all the time.
Yeah.
But why is it so important for our metabolism?
It's not just about burning calories. Exercise actually improves insulin sensitivity, reduces inflammation, and can even increase mitochondrial function.
So it's like a tune-up for our metabolic engines.
That's a great way to think about it, and you don't have to do anything crazy. Even moderate exercise can make a big difference.
That's good to hear. So we can have a real impact on our metabolic health just by making some lifestyle changes.
Absolutely. These metabolic systems are incredibly complex, but thankfully there's a lot we can do to support them.
This has been so informative. I feel like I've learned so much about how our bodies work and how to take care of them.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Me too.
Yeah.
And we'll have to continue this conversation in another episode. There's just so much to learn.
I agree. There's always more to discover.
All right. Well, until next time, stay curious.
And stay healthy.
Welcome back to our deep dive on fuel metabolism. Before the break, we were starting to get into how cells manage their energy balance.
Right, we were talking about those hormonal signals and how they interact with cells.
Yeah, exactly. So what happens inside the cell once those signals get there? I mean, it can't just be random, right?
Of course not. Cells have these really sophisticated mechanisms for sensing what's going on and responding to changes.
Okay, so what are these mechanisms and how do they actually work?
Well, to understand that, we have to zoom in even further and look at some of the key players inside the cell.
All right, I'm ready. Take me there.
One of the most important ones is an enzyme called AMP-activated protein kinase, or AMPK for short. You can think of AMPK as the cell's energy sensor.
An energy sensor. So, like, it can actually tell how much energy the cell has available.
Exactly. It gets activated when the cell's energy charge is low. Remember how we talked about ATP being the cell's primary energy currency?
Yeah, ATP is like the fuel that powers everything.
Exactly. And when ATP levels drop, a molecule called AMP starts to accumulate.
So it's like ATP is the full battery and AMP is the almost empty one.
That's a great analogy. And when that ratio of AMP to ATP increases, it's a signal to the cell that energy is running low.
And that's when AMPK gets activated, right? It's like it's sounding the alarm.
Precisely. And once AMPK is activated, it sets off this whole cascade of events to try and restore the cell's energy balance.
So what does it do? Like, how does it actually help?
Well, one of the things it can do is stimulate glucose uptake so the cell can get more fuel.
Okay, that makes sense.
It can also promote fatty acid oxidation, which is another way for the cell to produce energy.
So it's like kicking the cell's metabolism into high gear.
You could say that.
But what about when the cell has plenty of energy? Does AMPK just switch off?
That's where another important player comes in. It's an enzyme called mTOR.
mTOR.
Yeah, it stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. But basically, you can think of it as AMPK's counterpart. It gets activated when nutrients are abundant, and it promotes growth and biosynthesis.
So AMPK is like the energy saver, and mTOR is the growth promoter.
Exactly. mTOR is all about building new proteins and lipids and organelles, and it kicks into gear when the cell has the resources to do so.
Okay, so it's like the cell's in building mode when mTOR is active.
Precisely.
So we have these two opposing forces, AMPK and mTOR, working together to keep the cell's energy balanced.
Exactly. And that balance is really crucial for maintaining what we call metabolic homeostasis.
Homeostasis, I remember that from biology class. It means keeping everything stable, right?
That's right. And metabolic homeostasis is all about keeping that delicate balance between energy intake, storage, and expenditure. It's what keeps our bodies working properly.
So AMPK and mTOR are essential for making sure our cells are using energy efficiently.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all fascinating. But I have to ask, what happens when this balance gets disrupted?
Well, that's when things can start to go wrong, and we can see links to various metabolic disorders. For example, excessive mTOR activation has been implicated in conditions like obesity and even some types of cancer.
Oh, wow. So overactivating the growth promoter can be a bad thing.
It can. On the other hand, insufficient AMPK activity has been linked to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes.
So if the energy saver isn't working properly, our cells might not be able to regulate blood sugar as effectively.
Exactly. And these are just a couple of examples. There's still so much research being done to understand this complex interplay between AMPK and mTOR and how it affects our health.
It really is fascinating. Okay, so before we move on to talking about specific metabolic disorders, I'm curious about another group of molecules I've heard about, the sirtuins.
Ah, yes, the sirtuins. They've been getting a lot of attention lately, and for good reason. They're like the wise old sages of the cellular world.
Eyes old sages.
Well, they're involved in a lot of different processes,
All right.
including regulating metabolism, protecting against cellular stress, and even influencing lifespan.
So they're like the cell's guardians.
You could think of it that way. They're really fascinating enzymes.
Okay, so how do they actually work?
Well, they belong to a class of enzymes called deacetylases, which means they remove acetyl groups from proteins.
Acetyl groups. Remind me what those are again.
They're basically chemical tags that can attach to proteins and change how they function.
Oh, okay.
And when sirtuins remove those acetyl groups, it can have a big impact on the protein's activity, stability, and even where it goes inside the cell.
So they're like little switches, turning proteins on or off depending on what the cell needs.
That's a great way to put it. And what's even more interesting is that sirtuins need a molecule called NAD+ to do their job.
NAD plus D. That rings a bell.
It's involved in a lot of important metabolic reactions, especially those related to energy production.
Right. I remember learning about it in biochemistry.
And the ratio of NAD+ to its reduced form, NADH, tells us a lot about the cell's metabolic state, especially its energy levels.
So sirtuins can actually sense the cell's energy status through this NAD plus NADH ratio.
Exactly. When the cell has plenty of energy and NAD+ levels are high, sirtuins are more active. And that increased activity has been linked to a bunch of beneficial effects, like improved mitochondrial function, reduced inflammation, and even better DNA repair.
Wow, so they're like the cell's maintenance crew, making sure everything is running smoothly?
That's a good analogy. And one of the things they help regulate is the activity of PGC1.
PGC1.
Yeah, it's a really important protein that helps control the production of new mitochondria.
So sirtuins help activate PGC1, which then tells the cell to build more mitochondria.
Exactly. And having more mitochondria means the cell can produce energy more efficiently.
This is so cool. It's like this whole network of regulators all working together to keep the cell's energy balanced and healthy.
It really is. But of course, sometimes things go wrong.
Right. We were talking about how imbalances in AMPK and mTOR can lead to things like obesity and diabetes. Can you tell me more about that? Like, how does all of this actually lead to those diseases?
Sure. Let's start with obesity. We know that mTOR is a key driver of cell growth and biosynthesis, especially when nutrients are plentiful. And if we're constantly eating a lot of calorie-rich foods, it can lead to chronic activation of mTOR.
So the cells are always in growth mode.
Exactly. And that can lead to excess fat storage, which can then cause problems like inflammation and insulin resistance.
And insulin resistance is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, right?
That's right. When cells become resistant to insulin, they don't respond to it properly, and glucose can't get into the cells as easily.
So blood sugar levels stay high.
Exactly. And over time, that can damage blood vessels and nerves and lead to all sorts of complications.
So there's a clear link between obesity and type 2 diabetes.
There is, and it's not just about the total amount of fat, but also where that fat is stored.
What do you mean?
Well, visceral fat, the kind of fat that surrounds our organs, is particularly problematic. It's more metabolically active and tends to release more inflammatory molecules.
So it's not just about losing weight, but also about losing the right kind of fat.
That's a good point. And this brings us back to inflammation.
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier. How does inflammation contribute to all of this?
Well, inflammation is a complex process, but basically it's the body's response to injury or infection. And when we have excess fat, especially visceral fat, it can trigger a low-grade inflammatory response that just keeps simmering.
So obesity itself can cause inflammation.
Exactly. And that inflammation can then interfere with insulin signaling, making insulin resistance even worse.
So it's like a double whammy.
It is.
Okay, this is all pretty intense. It sounds like these metabolic disorders are really serious.
They are. But the good news is that we have a lot of control over our metabolic health.
So what can we do to help?
Well, lifestyle factors like diet and exercise are incredibly important.
Okay, so what kind of diet is best for metabolic health?
The key is to focus on whole, unprocessed foods. Fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, healthy fats, those kinds of things.
So basically eating real food, not processed junk.
Exactly. And it's also important to be mindful of portion sizes. We don't want to overload our systems.
Right.
And then on the exercise front, getting regular physical activity is incredibly important.
Okay, yeah. We all know we should exercise more, but
Mhm.
how does it actually help our metabolism?
Well, like we were talking about earlier, it can improve insulin sensitivity. It also helps reduce inflammation and can even boost mitochondrial function.
So it's not just about burning calories.
Not at all. It has so many benefits for our metabolic health.
This is great information. So even though these metabolic disorders are complex, there's a lot we can do to prevent or manage them.
Absolutely. It's all about making healthy choices and supporting these amazing systems that our bodies have.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so we've talked about how individual cells and organs work to maintain energy balance, but how does it all come together for the whole organism? How do all these systems communicate and coordinate?
That's a great question. Let's shift gears now and look at how energy homeostasis is coordinated at a higher level.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this incredible journey exploring fuel metabolism.
Yeah, from tiny cells to the whole body working together, it's amazing.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I love how we've been building this understanding of how energy homeostasis works, like at all these different levels.
It's all connected, right?
Totally. So we've talked about how individual organs contribute, like the liver with glucose, muscles switching fuel sources, even fat playing a role with hormones like leptin.
And it's not just each organ doing its own thing. They're constantly talking to each other, right?
Yeah, sending signals back and forth, making sure everyone has the energy they need.
Exactly. It's like this amazing communication network, all orchestrated to make sure the body runs smoothly.
So can you give me an example of how that communication actually works? Like how does one organ let another know what's going on?
Sure. Imagine you're exercising. Your muscles are working hard.
Okay, yeah.
They're burning through their fuel. They need more energy.
I can definitely relate to that feeling.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens is the muscles release these signaling molecules into the bloodstream.
Signaling molecules.
Yeah, basically chemical messengers. It's like they're sending out an SOS saying, hey, we need more fuel over here.
So the muscles are putting out a call for help.
Exactly. And one of the organs that picks up that message loud and clear is the liver.
The liver again. It's like the ultimate team player.
It really is. So the liver gets the message and it ramps up its glucose production.
So it's like the liver is constantly monitoring what's going on and adjusting to meet the body's needs.
Exactly. It's like a metabolic control center, making sure everyone gets the energy they need. And that back and forth between the muscles and the liver, that's just one example of how this incredible communication system works.
This is so cool. But what about the brain? Does it play a role in all this communication too?
Absolutely. In fact, the brain is kind of like the CEO of the whole operation.
Okay, I like that analogy.
It's getting all these reports from different organs, all these hormonal signals, and it takes all that information and makes decisions about energy intake, storage, expenditure.
Wow. So it's like the brain is the ultimate decision maker when it comes to energy.
Exactly. And one of the key players in the brain for all of this is the hypothalamus.
The hypothalamus, right.
Yeah. It's getting input from hormones like leptin, insulin, ghrelin. It's constantly monitoring the body's energy status.
So it's like the brain is always keeping tabs on everything.
It is. And then based on all that information, it can send out signals to adjust things like how much we eat, how much energy we burn, even our body temperature.
Wow, that's amazing. So we've gone from those tiny cellular mechanisms all the way up to the brain coordinating this whole body energy dance.
I know, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. And I think it just highlights how incredible our bodies are and how important it is to take care of them, you know?
Absolutely. These systems are so complex and they're working so hard all the time. We really need to support them.
So what can we do?
Well, thankfully, we have more control than we might think. Lifestyle choices like diet and exercise can make a huge difference.
Okay, let's talk about diet first.
Yeah.
What are some key things people can do to support their metabolic health?
Well, the foundation is really focusing on whole, unprocessed foods.
Makes sense. So fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, healthy fats.
Exactly. Giving our bodies the nutrients they need without overloading them.
It's about quality fuel, not just quantity.
Exactly. And it's also important to be mindful of portion sizes. We don't want to be constantly overeating.
Because that sends the wrong signals to our bodies.
It does. Our bodies are designed to maintain balance. And if we're constantly pushing them too far in one direction, things can start to go wrong.
What about exercise? I know we all hear that we need to exercise more, but why is it so important for our metabolic health specifically?
Well, we've talked about how it improves insulin sensitivity,
Right.
but it also helps reduce inflammation, and it can actually improve how well our mitochondria function.
So it's like exercise helps our cells produce energy more efficiently.
Exactly. And the good news is, it doesn't have to be anything crazy intense. Even moderate exercise, like brisk walking or swimming, can have significant benefits.
That's good to hear. So even small changes can make a difference.
They can. It's all about finding ways to move our bodies regularly and make it a sustainable part of our lifestyle.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how my body works and what I can do to take care of it.
It's been my pleasure. It's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
It really is, and it makes me want to learn even more. I guess that's what deep dives are all about.
That's right. Always learning, always exploring.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this amazing journey into the world of fuel metabolism.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you learned something new today. Until next time, stay curious and take care of yourselves.